We meet again here for the Daily Bread Bible Study. Now, this is day 149, Thursday, May 28th, 2020, focusing on Job chapters 9 through 12. We continue this discussion, this back and forth with this theology of friends who think that Job has sinned and therefore God is punishing him because he sinned, and Job feeling like he's done nothing wrong and wanting an explanation for why bad things happen to good people. So in Job chapter 9, even with Bildad speaking hopeful words to Job, this does not help the man. Now, Job does not see or understand what God is doing, as it says in Job 9:11 through 12. Look, he passes by me, and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. He snatches away, and who can stop him? Who will say to him, what are you doing? Right? Nobody's going to hold God accountable for God's actions. God gets to do whatever God wants. And so a statement here is from Job about what he sees God doing in Job 9:17. He crushes me with a tempest. He multiplies my wounds without cause. And so in Job 9:22, it is all one, therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. And so, in this, Job is, kind of counteracting, this sense of his friends who say, there is this sense of divine fairness. And Job saying, that his experience of life is just not fairness, right? It's just that this suffering is happening for both the blameless and the wicked. In Job 9:24, he says, the earth is given into the hand of the wicked, God's, citing God's permission to let Satan kind of test and do these things to Job. So Job fears that appealing to God, who is allowing the suffering to happen, will be taken as sin. In Job chapter 9:29, he says, I shall be condemned. Why then do I labor in vain? Why do I worry about any of this? Why should I worry about what God is up to or God is doing in all of this? I'm trying to make it through this pain and suffering. I still prefer to be killed because the suffering is great, but if I raise up a concern or curse God, right, it is sin worthy of being condemned. And so he's not going to do it. He's just going to try and do what he's been doing, which is just express verbally his and process his suffering out loud. And so in Job 10, he continues on, 10 verse 15, if I am righteous, I cannot lift up my head, for I am filled with disgrace and look upon my affliction. He's stuck in his suffering, right? And he can't get out of that suffering. He's just in the midst of this suffering and pain that God is allowing and permitting to happen with him. And so he's just feeling disgraced, and that's ashamed. That's where he's at. In Job 10:20, he says, are not the days of my life few? Let me alone, that I may find a little comfort. So here is where he's kind of asking God to remove this suffering from him, that he might be able to have comfort. And so in Job chapter 11, after hearing all of his friends processing, now it's finally Zophar's turn to speak. Zophar, one of the three friends, they're Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So it's Zophar's turn to speak as a, quote, friend of Job. In Job 11, verse 6, he says that God would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for wisdom is many-sided, which is kind of a positive thing. He's saying that, through all of this, ask for God. God will open up wisdom. But the bad, again, goes back to that theology in verse 6. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. So Zophar, is not only judging Job to be worthy of the suffering, but also saying, hey, you're getting off easy because, all of these things, these comments that you're making about of, talking back to God, it's just tisk, 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 no. And then he begins to give a lecture on the wisdom of God as a self-righteous, kind of individual. So in Job 11:13, he says, if you direct your heart rightly, which, by the way, assumes that Job is not directing his heart rightly with God, continues on in verse 15 through 16, you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure and will not fear. You will forget your misery. You will remember it as waters that have passed away. And then in verse 19, we have Zophar, saying, you will lie down and no one will make you afraid. So Job again, looks at his friend who just doesn't get it and just continues to lecture him about things that he already knows and just making this experience even more unhelpful for him. So replying to his friends as a whole, Job says, you are laughing at me, essentially, saying, I am a laughing stock, right? And then says, those at ease have contempt for misfortune in Job 12:5. He's pointing to his friends that, they are, through their actions, they're showing contempt for his misfortune, right? And saying, that he must have sinned. Job speaks to God and says, Job 12:10, in his hands is the life of every living thing and the breath of every living human being. And then says that Job 12:16, the deceived and the deceiver are his. So Satan is called the accuser, but that sounds awfully familiar to say that the people that the allowance of this sinful influence to be present, and that the experience of the sinful influence on a person itself, that is in some sense a responsibility of God, a God who is willing to allow these things to happen. And so he's not saying that God is unjustified in this, but he's saying that these things implicate God. And so in Job 12:23, he says, he makes nations great and then destroys them. He enlarges nations and then leads them away, which also sounds awfully familiar to what happens, in the exile to Judah. And we see that the nation of Judah is exiled and taken away into Babylon and then is able to return, later on. So I think all of this is, connected with the processing of what's happening for the Jewish community as they are, exiled away and then coming back. And, all of these themes and threads are pulled out here in Job and trying to think about, why is it that bad things happen to good people? So we get all this theology, all this discussion, and it's a lot to unpack. It doesn't mean that you have to hold all of these theological positions that Job has. Doesn't mean I understand half of what Job is wrestling with here. But in this briefest sense of it, we witness and see Job suffering and see his wrestlings with that. So as you find yourself in suffering, as you call upon God and seek to have some response from God, know that Job has been there, know that people in our humanity have been there, and know that you are not alone. So may you have some assurance as we continue to wander through this discussion of suffering here in the book of Job.